Hi, my name is Brad Emery, and this is my case study for Module 9, When Ethics and Policies Collide. As far as the summary of this case and looking at the facts, we're seeing a new assistant principal, Richard Inman, who is working on building relationships with difficult students and has had a lot of success in this area. But he's encountered an altercation between James and David, who's an honors student. There's a weapon that was exchanged and confiscated, and this has led to some disciplinary action for both students that's kind of caused a clash with the policies of school as well as Mr. Inman's personal ethics and what that means for the good of the students. As far as looking at legal or ethical issues, there's a lot in this case. You've got the felony possession of a weapon on school property, which is your legal side of things, and that's led to some issues with the juvenile justice systems. We have the question of, did David have his rights violated when he was searched for that weapon in the first place, not knowing that anything illegal actually did occur? We've got a zero-tolerance school policy, which is clearly not the best circumstances or not the best solution in this case, but that's going to lead to some ethical issues for Mr. Inman. We're going to have some long-term effects for David, and this really brings some leverage against the assistant principal's position and could cause him some serious difficulties in this area. So as far as what exactly has happened, well, James has confessed to pressuring David into carrying a weapon for him, and now both students are facing felony charges in addition to expulsion because of a zero-tolerance school policy. Looking at the people who are involved in this case, we see Richard Inman as the assistant principal and the disciplinary school administrator in this instance. We have James, the offending student, as well as David Ramos, our honors student, who was caught up in all of this. There is the school police officer that actually executed the arrests and was in the room to conduct the search. We have the families of both students, and coming into the picture is the director of secondary ed, who's pushing for the enforcement of their school policies and putting pressure on Mr. Inman in that circumstance. This is taking place at Rocket Junior High with at least some measure of a difficult student population coming from the south side. We see it's a large school with 900 plus students. And this is we know that it's a junior high school. Presumably that covers grades 9 and 10, but additional details about the population and demographics and things of the school, the curriculum are really not well known or not covered in the material for this case. So looking at this information, kind of reviewing it and prioritizing what comes into play here, we have two students and two families that are directly affected by the resolution of this particular problem. This is setting up and establishing not only a policy that the school already has in place, but it's setting a precedent for the future if something like this were to happen again. The actions taken by the assistant principal, Mr. Inman, and what he chooses to do in these circumstances could potentially lead to some long-term consequences and a case study, as it were, within the district for how policies like this and issues like this one should be and will be handled. The primary principal really hasn't been mentioned at all, and he is someone, or she, that I would definitely want more information from before moving forward very much farther. And I would also seek a lot more contact and communication with the district leadership who are setting these policies and really pushing for the enforcement of them in this case as well. It would be beneficial to contact the juvenile system in this local area as well, just to kind of get their feel for what David is looking at and where his options fall on a legal side outside of the school system as well. So looking at possible options and consequences of those options, we always want to take a look at just doing nothing, taking no action, and then consider the most extreme or on the far edge of the spectrum of action. So if we were to take no action, we find that the parents in the district would have to work out the solution. and we just kind of let that fall on other people. Whereas on the extreme side of the action, the assistant principal has the option to really become involved in this and push hard against that zero tolerance policy. He rather could fight the school policy and even go public with this situation. Other options, Mr. Inman could just relent on what he's been doing and go ahead and submit paperwork for David, putting him into that district program, alternative education program, in which would serve his 45-day or more suspension. He could continue his current course of action, or he could take some time and kind of discuss and hash this out with the upper administration. So looking at the options and what the consequences are for them, when we take no action or if we ignore the situation, there's the very high likelihood that Mr. Inman will be knocked for poor job performance, as would be the proper response in that circumstance. And you're dealing with an unresolved issue, because even if the parents of the district get it taken care of, this is one thing that an administrator had the opportunity to step into and help, and has chosen not to do so, and that's going to have long-term lasting consequences on his authority as well. On the flip side of that, going to the other end of the spectrum and pushing hard against this could very easily lead Mr. Inman to lose his job. There could be potential legal repercussions should he choose to go public with this and bring it to the local news stations or something along those lines. And you're going to get a strong and a passionate community response if you take the extreme action and blow this up into a community issue. And there's certainly could be some value in making it a community issue, but on this end of the spectrum, really, it's not going to be handled in a good way that would be beneficial to the school and the students within the school. So looking at a few other options and the consequences of those, taking the option to relent and submit paperwork for David, that student's caught up and he's possibly consumed by this system and the disciplinary action, and it seems like Mr. Inman's conscience and ethics would be compromised in such a way that would make him really struggle to be effective as an administrator continuing in this job. So if he chooses to continue the current course of action, we're going to find that he ends up with an official reprimand in his record, which in my opinion doesn't seem like the end of the world, especially when you do the right thing in a situation like this. But we would love to find a solution where maybe that's not what the end result is. And the advantage of this one is Mr. Inman's going to have personal peace about the situation. He's going to be okay no matter what happens, knowing that he did the right thing as far as he sees it. Our third option that we talked about was discussing the situation with the upper administration. And so looking at that purpose and the practical application of the current policy, just figuring out why do we have things the way we do. Maybe that'll be more frustrating than when we started, or maybe that'll give some good answers and present some opportunities for some flexibility or even a solution that we didn't see to begin with. So the tricky part about that is you're going to get uncertain results, and we'll talk more about the possible change or pushback from administration in just a moment. So as you've probably figured out at this point, I believe the best option is to continue with the current action, but to discuss this situation with upper administration. So I think we need to talk to that director of secondary education, as well as the primary principal of the school, and anyone else who's involved with this current decision and the policies that kind of underlie it, and find out what's the purpose of these policies. Why do we have them in place, and are we achieving that purpose through the practical application of that policy for a student like David? So what I mean by that is if we have a zero tolerance policy in place to make sure that students are provided with the best education and a safe learning environment, are we really doing what's best for David and giving him a safe learning environment by sending him to the disciplinary education school and pull-out program? And is that really hurting anyone else in our current building by David not being there? And I think the obvious answer is no, it's not hurting anyone in the current building, but it is causing harm to David. So the biggest danger I see in this course of action is, depending on your administration and your superiors, you could really rub some feathers the wrong way, and you could either lead to a pushback that could make your job miserable. It could cost you your job. They could just say that they're flat out not going to do anything along those lines, or in a good scenario, a positive case, maybe they're willing to talk about this. Maybe the administration looks at you and looks at this situation through a different lens and tries out some different options and goes for a change. I think the danger here is it actually can hurt to ask. But I think the benefits outweigh the risks of having this discussion with your superiors. So tying in with that, as I've mentioned here a couple of times, this is one of those tricky solutions. It's not black or white. It falls into a gray area because the fact of the matter is the results of this are going to be uncertain. And so I think going into this, you need to be willing to accept that the results may not be what you want them to be. You may still end up with that disciplinary action, but from the get-go, you need to make sure that you believe in what you're doing, and if you're going to continue to stand up for David, as I believe you should, in a situation such as this, be ready to take the consequences, be they good or bad, in these circumstances. So thank you for taking the time to watch this case study, and I hope that you have a great evening.